Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Flying solo again this week as Jerod is unable to be with us, but I have a special guest, somebody whose work I really respected from the time that I met Mike. I think it was actually, and Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the first time I really got a chance to talk to you or be around you was our trip to Montreal back in 2014. But Mike Miller, formerly of the Bloomington Herald-Times, now living in St. Louis, doing some freelance work, also running crimsonquarry.com, which is part of the SB Nation and Vox Media portfolio of sites. Mike, it's good to have you back and good to talk with you.
It's great to talk to you. And like you said, yeah, the first time we met, I think, was indeed in Montreal, that famous Montreal trip that I go back and think about. We ate a lot of poutine that trip. I think we ate more poutine during that trip than I've eaten in the 6 years since. So I think about that trip often. That was a good time.
It was funny. Like a couple of weeks ago, I did a podcast where with the Hoosier Heartland podcast, where they interviewed me, and I'm not often comfortable being interviewed about my career, but one of the questions that they asked me was about what was one thing that you've gotten to do, like while covering IU basketball, that like the most memorable thing. And I think back to that trip, and not only did we get to see, I think 5 games in 6 days, but we got to go around a new place that I think none of us had been to before, and see different things that maybe we would have never experienced before. So to me, that was really a lot of fun, and I think a unique opportunity that none of us may get again in terms of covering college sports. So that was pretty cool.
That was awesome. It really was. I mean, honestly, when I think back to my, how many years was I on that beat? 5, something like that?
5, I think. Yeah.
I mean, we took some really fun trips. I mean, that was, outside of the grind of trying to report and follow a, major university athletic program, like the trips we took to Montreal, to Maui, to Honolulu. I mean, and everything that kind of coincided with those trips. I think back to, just covering Tom Crean through those different trips and the different sides of Tom we saw, both good and bad. I mean, we saw Tom trying to be more relaxed in Montreal. We saw him extremely relaxed in Honolulu, and sandwiched in between, we saw him stressed as all hell in Maui back in 2015. It was fun to honestly see the program in sort of a different light when you get them in those different settings. But yeah, that Montreal trip was a blast.
One of the reasons I wanted to have you on is coming up at the end of the month, Fred Glass is going to be formally stepping away from his post as IU's athletic director. And there was a story, I'm not sure if you saw it this week, I don't know if you want to call it a story, but a list that Jeff Goodman and Brett McMurphy did over at Stadium, where they were ranking the Big Ten athletic directors. It was basically assigning all of them a letter grade, and it was based on their hires in men's basketball and their hires in football. And I wanted to get your perspective just overall on Fred Glass's tenure at IU and how it should be viewed, because I think there's a lot of people who can acknowledge that there's a lot of great things that have happened with IU athletics in terms of facilities. There's a lot of great things in maybe some of the non-revenue sports that have been outstanding. You look at the baseball program, what they were able to do going to a College World Series, and getting the new volleyball facility built. I think softball has a new facility. I mean, you just kind of look around the campus and so many great things have happened. Swimming and diving is obviously a great program. Kind of the list goes on. But then you look at football, which obviously had a really great season last year under Tom Allen. That was a hire Fred Glass. But you look at basketball, and to me, it's kind of the golden egg of IU athletics. And it hasn't been where people want it to be now for a long time, and still isn't. So how do you kind of reconcile Fred's career overall as athletic director at IU? Should it be viewed as a success? Is it more of an incomplete based on kind of the failure to get men's basketball back to where many people think it should be?
I think, just upfront, personally speaking, I would say it's in total, it's definitely a positive when you look back at everything he did. And you touched on really the key, though, for I think a lot of people, there's always going to be, a perception that his legacy is sort of riding on Archie Miller, which is fair. Basketball, pays a lot of bills. It's the identity of the department. It's something you absolutely have to get right. But, if we look at the department as a whole, outside of basketball, I think Fred has, unquestionably done a ton to make the department something that I think IU fans can at least be proud of. I mean, there's, that's beyond facilities. I mean, yes, he got stuff done. He got stuff built. But he also, I think, delivered a level of almost, it feels weird to say, but almost a level of professionalism across the department where I think people almost underestimate. I don't want to say how bad things were, but how sort of inconsistent, how sort of weird things were when he took over. I mean, the hand he was dealt when he took over, it was not necessarily a pretty picture. There was a lot of stuff that had to get fixed. And at the same time, basketball is always going to be the most visible part of the equation for any athletic director at IU. And so a lot of people are going to view his tenure through the lens of championships in men's basketball or just general success in men's basketball. Fairly or unfairly, that's the way it's going to be. Sure, if you're only looking at him through that lens, then yeah, sure, you're going to be able to find fault in parts of his tenure, or maybe even opt to call it incomplete in some form or fashion. But I also think you're kind of kidding yourself if you refuse to acknowledge the mostly positive impact he's had in his decade or so running the show. I mean, just like you said, look at the athletics campus. I mean, before you even walk through the doors of the buildings and really dig into the programs which are housed there, just look at how 17th Street just currently looks. I mean, first of all, you finally have I think just about all of the programs outside of like swimming and rowing are right there in close proximity on 17th Street. I mean, I got to Bloomington in early 2012, and in just that time, the transformation is remarkable. And, you compare what it looks like now to what it did back in, say, 2000, 2005. I mean, it's night and day. It really is, just from, building up the athletics campus point of view. It's certainly due in large part to the Big Ten Network money that has been funneling in over the last decade. But, even from that regard, I think he did a mostly good job of managing that money and directing it to places where it needed to go, on top of all the money he was able to raise. And so really when it comes to how he built up IU athletics, both in the literal sense and maybe the abstract sense this past decade, I think it's hard to find fault with the decisions that were made and the roads that were taken, in most cases. I think a lot of folks who dump on Fred Glass either aren't aware of or purposely ignorant to how much construction and building and reimagining had to take place when he took over. So I think, generally speaking, when you take that 30,000 foot view of everything that's happened this past decade, I think it's been without question a net positive.
In terms of just the facilities in general, what do you think maybe was the biggest accomplishment that he had? And because there's so many different things that you mentioned 17th Street looking completely different, everything that's popped up. I mean, is there any one project that stood out in your eyes that was especially impressive, or is it just the accumulation of all the different things that he was able to do?
I would lean more toward just the accumulation of all of it, getting it all done in that span, because it's not easy work. And I think both Fred and Scott Dolson too, I think deserves some credit here as well, just because he was really played a leading role in, I think, a lot of the fundraising that had to happen with the varsity club and so forth to get a lot of this stuff built. As someone who spent his springs in Bloomington covering IU baseball, the way it all kind of coincided with getting into the new stadium, getting to the College World Series, building that program into really the crown jewel of the Big Ten when you look at support, both in terms of the department, fan support, the ability to recruit to basically a minor league stadium, a minor league quality stadium. And I say that, in a good sense. That is truly remarkable, just the way that program took off. I mean, it's probably almost unfathomable to anyone who followed IU baseball, decades ago, just to kind of see the trajectory the program's been on. But having that facility, having that program kind of come together at that time in 2013, 14, and really take off, I think was pretty remarkable. But I'd also say the football Memorial Stadium too, and closing that. Part of it, I think a lot of that is really symbolic, more so than it is, I don't want to say practical, but like the sense that they were actually kind of like enclose the circle and continue just to show further investment in that facility, in that program, I think speaks a lot. Some of his biggest accomplishments, during his time, as far as getting the football program to a level where it's, not only respected by its peers in the Big Ten, which I think it's starting to get to that point, but, as, a program that recruits, as a program that has tried to atone for years of neglect. I think just in total, the buildings that he was able to get done, I think just in sum, I think it taken together, I think it's all pretty impressive that he was able to get all of that done in the time that he had.
You mentioned the name Scott Dolson, and as it was the athletic director process in terms of making a decision. I think he announced that he was going to step away. I want to say it was back in December, and then we finally heard the name or the decision. I think it was in March, when not long after everything with COVID-19 hit. How surprised were you that Scott Dolson was the choice, and how big of a factor do you think just having the continuity within the department in a really uncertain and uncharted time for college athletics in general, how much do you think that played into Scott Dolson ultimately being the pick?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the continuity is definitely, probably the biggest factor in a guy who's just been around IU since the 80s and knows every little nook and cranny inside the department, what needs to be done, what needs to be fixed, what's going well, what's not. But especially when you couple that with just the current climate and being able to, maintain what should be a steady hand, at least initially, to sort of guide you through the unknown here the next few months. I think that was huge. And, certainly from the standpoint of just department morale too, just having a guy everyone knows to, you're not facing this prospect of sudden upheaval, whether you're a coach, whether you're a support staffer, whomever. I think that's a huge factor. And two, to kind of go back to, the point about the fundraising, you have a guy who already has these established relationships. And, you look at some of the reported finalists for that job, whether it was, Chris Reynolds or Pat Kraft. I mean, these are guys too who, they wouldn't be coming in necessarily cold. I mean, they know people too. They would be able to figure out, I'm sure they would, I don't really think if you're looking at those three choices, I'm not sure there's really a wrong hire. And at the same time, when Fred Glass announced that he was stepping down at the end of the year, I think a lot of people, myself included to a point, were wondering, how could this department, as much as Fred Glass has done, and as much as he has really steadied that department and put it on, level footing, could it benefit from some new blood? And I think that's a fair question you have to ask anytime you're making, a hire, particularly one as important as athletic director. And I guess just the way it all played out, it's probably best they didn't. It's probably best that they retained a guy who, frankly, was a finalist last time, was very close to getting this back in 2008 or 9. a guy who people trust. And I think it'll remain to be seen, just obviously, how it will play out in the long term. But I think short term, I think it worked out really well to have a guy like Scott Dolson, a guy that, I really haven't heard a bad thing about Scott Dolson from anyone in the department in the, almost a decade of being around IU athletics. I think that, especially in the short term, I think that it'll be a move that will potentially work out well for them.
So your first season on the beat was the 2014-15 season, which would have been the year that Blackman and Robert Johnson were freshmen. IU, I believe, made the tournament, lost that year to Wichita State out in Omaha. And then, you wrapped up with the Romeo season. I believe you left after that year. When Fred made the decision to move away from Tom Crean, I was looking back at some of the stories that were written back at that time, and he mentioned things like Big Ten championships, national championships, and we're 3 years in, obviously, now to the Archie Miller era. And you look at kind of what's happened since that time. He's going into season 4, and I think most people, and I've said this multiple times on the podcast, that Indiana would have made the tournament this year if there would have been one, but there's a lot of question now, I think, kind of what happens next with IU basketball, specifically this season. I feel like the expectations are going to be ramped up a little bit because they've got Trace Jackson-Davis coming back, Christian Lander coming in, and really it's just now going to be year 4 of Archie Miller's era. Kind of how do you assess kind of the state of IU basketball, where the program is from when you first started covering it to where it is now? Has any progress been made, or is it kind of just stuck in the same spot in your eyes?
I think there's definitely been progress behind the scenes. And this, I think, sort of speaks to Fred Glass too. A lot of people might look at his tenure through the basketball lens again, and people might talk about the extension he gave Crean, that wasn't great, or maybe he kept Tom Crean too long. I mean, those are things, maybe most people would point to when you look at the basketball program beyond just the fact that it didn't, win at a, sustained, consistent rate. I think it's easy to point to those things, but honestly, I think the biggest mistake that Fred Glass made in the Crean era was allowing that program to run the way that it did. So I guess think of it this way. The bulk of the Fred Glass era was spent trying to build up the department and introduce some level of organizational structure. And like I said earlier, basically Fred was trying to introduce some professionalism, some uniformity to, I think as best he could, get everyone up to a respectable level in their respective sports. And then you have men's basketball, which honestly exists on its own island in the scope of the department, both, figuratively and literally. It's got Assembly Hall and Cook Hall right there as, standalone facilities. And, we used to joke that, Cook Hall was more a bunker than it was a basketball facility, just because it always seemed that the basketball people were always in some way hiding from the public pressure, or hiding from, the most recent loss, or hiding from the media, or bumbling their way through the calendar, during, recruiting season. I think, to put it fairly, the basketball program was very disorganized under Tom Crean. I'm sure he would take exception to that characterization, but it's something I believe. And just for a moment, look beyond the results on the floor, for better or worse. It's the haphazard scheduling that Fred Glass allowed to persist. It's the the scattershot recruiting strategy that went on for years. I think if you're ever going to find fault in Fred Glass's managing of the basketball program, it's probably that he didn't really step in as much as he should, because it was kind of off the rails there at times. And so that's a long way of saying that there's been some progress, and that a lot of structural things needed to happen behind the scenes to really enable the IU basketball program to get where it wants to go. I mean, you talk about, you go back to the, press conference introducing Archie Miller, and you're talking about, the expectation for championships, and, living in that neighborhood and all that. To get there, so much had to be done behind the scenes. And, that's, building a scheduling philosophy that is, getting better results recruiting in the state of Indiana, getting better recruiting results, period. Just reinstalling some belief in that program that it knows what it's doing. That was stuff that was just not going to happen overnight. I mean, certainly you had some things that could have potentially distracted us from some of that stuff, like the Romeo Langford commitment and some of the recruiting hits that really are nice surface level, almost window dressing to distract from all the work that needs to go on behind the scenes. But that's something that's going to take time. But it does feel like there has been some progress in that regard. It definitely felt like at the time I left the beat and was covering that every single day, it definitely felt like the perception of IU basketball in the state had markedly improved. That felt like there was a new level of respect for what they were doing and the organization and just the philosophies that they had as a coaching staff. And so I say all that to be fair to Archie Miller, because also I also look at the results on the floor, and sure, they were going to be an NCAA tournament team this year, but I also feel like there's still not anything that this program can hang its hat on right now. I mean, sure, recruiting, yes, it has definitely recruited at the level that it's really hard to find a ton of fault. I mean, he certainly missed on some guys last spring, but I think by and large, you're probably splitting hairs if you're going to complain about the recruiting. That's fine. But, I'm still unsure whether they're really poised to jump a tier this year. I mean, could they? Yes, of course. Am I convinced they will? Not yet. There's still not really anything I can point to that Archie's teams are doing at an elite level. I think the closest thing you can try to point to is how they play defensively. But in what I saw from year 3, you still had guys who were older and were executing fundamentals poorly too often. I mean, if anything, I think that'll be the piece that can maybe get to that elite level, but it's not there yet. And it remains to be seen if this year's team, as constructed, will be the one to inch it closer to that. So I'm not sure. As far as exactly what this year is going to bring, I think I honestly go back and forth. I'm really not sure. I'm still not quite at a point where I can really feel my way where they're going to fit in the standings, how it's all going to look, how it's all going to fit. And that actually I think adds to the intrigue of it all, just the way they can play lineup wise and so forth. But anyway, that's a very long-winded way of saying, yes, I think there's progress. And certainly, as I think anyone would also acknowledge, there's still a ways to go.
You made a lot of interesting points. And I don't know if there's a good way to ask this, but as someone who has covered college athletics and, you didn't go to IU and you, to me, when you were on the beat, covered it as objectively and as fair as anybody. So I'm just curious, just from your perspective on the program, when do you feel like in a coach's tenure, and I'm not speaking specifically to Archie Miller, but you've been around Big Ten basketball, you've seen, several cycles through the league, you've seen coaches come and go. When do you think it's fair to start looking kind of at a coach's performance in terms of wins and losses? I mean, there's different, people will have different arguments. And in terms of Archie specifically, they'll say, well, the first couple of years he was playing with Crean's players and there was a lot of changes that had to happen. And then there'll be other people who think that the Romeo Langford year was a complete missed opportunity and they should have been better. But, I'm just kind of interested in your thoughts on when kind of you think people should really start to take a closer look at the wins and losses and how long do you think a coach really needs in a program in major college basketball to be fairly judged on their performance?
I think you're right around the point, looking at Archie Miller specifically, I think you're right around the point. I think, after year three, you should really start to have an idea. And I think year 4 is really where you should be expected to put it together. Because at that point, I mean, you've had the opportunity to start stacking some classes. You've presumably you're keeping the guys who want to be there, who want to be there with you, who believe in your system. You've had enough time to install a system. it's easy, I think, to have the knee-jerk reactions when things aren't going great and when you're failing, to reach the level of expectations that were there, during the Romeo Langford year, for example. It's easy to have those reactions that, this just isn't working. This may never really work out. And even to what I said moments ago about, not really having anything elite to hang your hat on right now. I can question myself. Is that fair enough? Am I being fair? But I think, again, I think year 3, you should really start to be able to show some signs that you are moving in that direction. And then year 4, year 5, 5 at the latest, depending on your situation. I think year 4 is really when you should be able to start putting those pieces in place and showing that your recruiting is paying off, showing that your system is installed. People understand the fundamentals of what you want to do. You have an idea of how best to use your personnel. That's not to say that, a guy like Archie Miller is coaching for his job this year, but, in a way, he almost is. I mean, this is kind of the year where I think we're going to have to expect a significant step forward in terms of how the product looks. And again, there's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of work that's had to go on behind the scenes to position a program like Indiana to get to that point. Are they there? I'm still not sure, but I do think that, looking at Archie Miller and him going into year 4, eventually this is a put up or shut up business. And I think it's high time that we start to see some of the things that he has sort of promised people that would happen.
I think you've been to every, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you've been to every road Big Ten venue. And I bring that up because a question I get often about IU basketball and the Big Ten in general is, the struggles of winning away from home. And I'm curious from your perspective, you've been to these different places all around the country. And last year we saw a situation in the Big Ten where it was, I believe the winning percentage for road teams in conference play in the league last year was the lowest. I don't know if it was overall, but I know the major conferences, it was the toughest place to go win on the road. What in your mind makes it so difficult in the Big Ten specifically to go win on the road, and how important do you think that's going to be for IU to kind of, if it's going to break through and get maybe back into that top tier with the Michigan States and the Michigans of the league, Wisconsin, how important is that to getting back up into that conversation?
Yeah, it's definitely important. It's something where I think just because of the structure of the Big Ten and the teams inside of it and the talent inside of those teams, I mean, even your worst teams are at least going to put up a fight. I mean, no one's rolling over. I mean, these are by and large well-funded programs who have good coaches and are able to recruit good players that you obviously can expect to fight wherever you go. And I think I think a big thing of winning on the road is just having. I hate to use the term culture because I think it's the most overused word in college athletics. But for lack of a better term, you have to have a culture of confidence and kind of knowing who you are as a program. To be transparent, I grew up following Maryland basketball when they were in the ACC. And I remember, as a kid watching those Gary Williams coach teams. I mean, Gary Williams operated with a sense of, us against the world. And you almost had to, if you were not, Duke, North Carolina, whomever else in the ACC at that time, you had to, he basically welcomed essentially this idea that, no one respects us in the ACC. We have to build up this idea that, it's just us versus the world. It's we have to trust in what we do, and we have to say screw it to everyone else and just take it to them for lack of other insight. But I think that really fostered the sense that, they could play anywhere. They could play anyone. And they largely did. I mean, those teams were very good in going on the road and going in tough environments and playing tough teams. And I think that was built year after year, this sense of, this is who we are. This is the kind of program that we are. This is the way we're going to play. And that's all there is to it. And, we're going to kick your ass. And I think that there are definitely some Big Ten programs that have had that sustained over time. And it certainly takes time to get there. But I also think that's part of the next step for Indiana is, you can say everyone's bought in, you can, you say all the right things, but it also has to look like that. And at times on the road last year, I mean, IU just got embarrassed. And obviously I think that points to still some hesitancy in guys not really knowing what they're doing or not really having clear cut, vision of their roles. And I think, that to win on the road, you have to have all those things. And it's something that you have to build up over time. And, certainly the most healthy or the, most structurally sound programs have that. But, it takes time. And to say it'll happen in year 4 for Indiana to get to the point where they're winning on the road consistently, I'm not sure, but you would at least hope that they're not getting, waxed and embarrassed, at places where they otherwise should not.
You mentioned before we started recording that you're doing some freelance work in St. Louis, and a lot of what you've been covering and writing about, obviously, is the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think I can speak for you and anybody who follows college sports, follows athletics in general, that that we all are rooting for a return to sports, a safe return to sports. But I'm curious. From the perspective of college football and college basketball, what's your level of optimism that that we're going to have college football in the fall and college basketball in the winter? I look at it as a good sign that they're obviously having at most schools having football athletes back on campus and doing workouts. I know some schools are being transparent in terms of testing results and others are not. And I think basketball is really going to get ramped up here in the next few weeks. But kind of what's your level of optimism that we get some type of college sports in the upcoming academic year?
I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful because, to be quite honest, that's almost all we have right now is hope and optimism. And I can't imagine living otherwise and, not believing that those things will happen, because right now I'm clinging to, that sports will return. So I have something to do at night, and to say nothing of have something to write about. So I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. And yet I'm also realistically looking at, beyond just college sports, looking at things, at the professional level that could be happening in short order, whether it's the NBA or Major League Baseball, the NHL, what have you. I'm looking at a lot of these plans, and they're plans put in place to get sports back, to make it work in some, new way, form, or fashion. And they're certainly, well thought out, and there are some contingencies in place in a lot of these plans. But at the same time, I think it's just, we don't really have a hold on this whole situation with viruses and testing and everything else. So while I cling to hope and I cling to optimism that we'll see sports, especially at college level, because God, I don't know what I'm going to write about at Crimson Quarry if there's nothing to do for the next year. I also know that, all of this is subject to change, and change very quickly at that. This is stuff that, despite everyone's best intentions to make it work, it's not foolproof. It's not completely guarded against the reality that, something could change, something could flare up, more positive tests in one area could cause a lot of concern, and, maybe one school wants to shut things down. I don't know how it's going to work. From that point of view, what if there's a huge spike in one team? There's so much stuff that, as much as we want to prepare for it, you cannot eliminate the risk of, contracting the virus right now. You can try to mitigate it, of course, but also B, we just don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And so I'm remaining hopeful and optimistic, but it's hard to really know exactly what this is going to look like, come August, when football's supposed to be, right around the corner. And, are they going to let fans in? How much? How's that going to work? we can all plan for it and should plan for it right now, but who's to say that any of that stuff will actually follow through as planned, once the time comes.
You mentioned Crimson Quarry. Before I have one other topic I want to get to you with you on quickly after this, but in terms of Crimson Quarry, I was obviously excited to see you back writing about IU athletics. Kind of what's, assuming, we do have football and basketball and all the other things to write about. Kind of what's your plan for that in terms of being able to write about IU athletics? Again, I'm sure it's going to be a little bit different than what you did as a beat reporter at the Herald Times, but what kind of things do you expect that you'll be able to do with that, assuming that things do ramp back up here in the fall?
Yeah, the reason I initially pursued it, I just felt it would be a fun opportunity because, on one hand, I just think that the current layout of IU athletics is really at an interesting point. Football is actually good, so that's something. And basketball is kind of at this point where, we almost expect them to be at where they can turn the corner and do some of the things that we just haven't seen in consistent doses the last few years. It feels like they're kind of getting to that point. And so, you look at the two marquee programs, it's really interesting. And I'm almost glad. I kind of needed a year away, honestly, after, the hyper local coverage that we gave IU athletics at the HT in my time there. It was kind of nice to step away from, really think about it, from a critical point of view for a year. But getting back, I just wanted to write about, what was going on. And this was an opportunity where I don't really have to be the beat writer, giving it the, right down the middle treatment. I can, take more of a, opinionated view and I think, honestly, the great thing about Crimson Quarry is that the current or the previous staff, they did such a great job of finding their own niche in a very crowded, media marketplace for IU athletics. I mean, there's so many different outlets that cover IU, and, sort of like you, I mean, I point to you all the time in the sense that Inside the Hall was, it found a way to cover IU basketball that really no one else was really doing. And so I always appreciated that about Crimson Quarry and covering the department as a whole, the way they did it with humor, with whimsy, with at times, critical, columns and opinions. That really appealed to me to just, cover this program I know a little bit about, this department I know a little bit about, and do it through, a different style. So, with that said, I think we're going to try to maintain some of the previous tone of the site to a point, while also, I do want to do some reporting. I want to do some, FOIA record requests. I want to unleash some scalding hot takes from time to time. And honestly, right now it's been kind of hard to settle into a rhythm, as you probably know. It's just been weird because you're constantly looking for stuff to write about, and I'm not really sure this is the time for scalding hot takes. So that's something it's an arrow I've kept in my quiver for the time being. But yeah, I think it'll be fun. Not the least of which why, because I just think that the subject matter itself will be interesting, and that's usually a recipe for having some fun with the work in front of you.
I want to get you out of here on one of your favorite things to talk about and tweet about, which is Taste of India. And I know from our direct messaging last night that you are missing Taste of India very much in Bloomington. And I also wanted to ask you, we had a lot of fun over, you did, and I had a lot of fun following it, over Cam's performances with his plate scores at Taste of India. Two-parter. One, how much are you missing Taste of India now that you can't go there regularly, living in St. Louis? And two, are you surprised that Cam never really kind of took your advice on how to properly prepare a plate to heart? It seemed like his plate scores over the course of his senior year really never got to the level that you were hoping for.
I'll answer the second part first. Yeah, it was a huge disappointment. And for those who don't know, so Cameron Drummond of Inside the Hall would post pictures of his buffet plates at Taste of India, and I would rate them on a traditional 1 to 10 scale, 10 being the best. And I think his probably average score was somewhere in the fives. I mean, like it was just the most uninspiring, blandest plate at a delicious Indian buffet that you could possibly imagine. It was not anything that I would be proud to take a picture of. So I would rate these and rate them pretty harshly, but also fairly, I think. And yeah, I don't know what it's going to take. I told him, you really got to explore the buffet. Let it come to you. And he never did that. He was always very heavy on the butter chicken, the rice. I think at one time he would throw in some paneer, but really never dove into some of the more interesting dishes in that buffet, which is a pretty comprehensive buffet and a delicious buffet. But to your first part, I miss it so much. But in our home here, we have a print, a sort of a illustration of the dining room Taste of India. It hangs in our dining room. And that was a gift to me, and I look at it almost daily to remind myself of all the afternoons I would just sort of wander into the Taste of India lunchroom and figure out what the hell I was going to write or what the hell I was going to be doing that day. It was just such a place of calm, a place of relaxation for me. It was on top of the delicious food. I miss it so much. I was talking to Zach Osterman with the Indy Star last night, and he actually sent me a picture of his Taste of India. He and his wife had ordered it for takeout last night. So it was nice to see a little picture of it, but it also took me back to seeing something that I just can't have in front of me until I get back to Bloomington, which who knows when that'll be. But yeah, I miss it every day. I love it. If you've never been to Taste of India, I highly recommend it. It's very good. I particularly recommend the buffet, though, knowing what we know now and the potential for there not to be any more buffets for anytime soon. I don't know if I would. I don't know. I guess I'm saying, like, if you missed out on Taste of India pre-pandemic, man, you really might have missed out on one of the best lunch options in Bloomington, a town that has a lot of great options.
Well, Mike, I joked all season with you on Twitter that you need to come back to Bloomington. We miss you, and it was in fun, but I did mean it. I think, I was glad to see you back writing about IU in some capacity. I think you did a tremendous job, and it was good to have you on the podcast. Good to catch up with you. I'm glad everything's going well for you in St. Louis. Everyone, obviously check out Crimson Quarry for Mike's work there. And thanks again for coming on the podcast. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Hey, anytime I can talk IU athletics and Taste of India, it brings me back to a very warm time in my life. So this was fun.
Thank you, Mike. Everyone will be back next week with another edition of Podcast on the Brink.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.